I hadn't stepped into this building in 6 years. 6 years since I was told I wasn't one of them, that I didn't belong. It's that legacy, bloodline, and appearances mattered more than ambition, education, or potential. The elevator doors opened onto the top floor of Brooks Carrington Logistics, my family's pride and joy. All glass and polished steel with a view that overlooked the Miami Marina. A view I once dreamed of working beneath back when I believed being born a Brooks meant something. I was 24 the last time I stood here, fresh out of MIT with dual master's degrees and a head full of ideas. That day I walked in, hoping to join the family business. I walked out humiliated, dismissed in front of an entire boardroom by my Aunt Margaret Brooks. But today, I returned as someone else entirely. Not Olivia, the ambitious niece. Not the girl who didn't fit the family mold. Today, I was the CEO of Orion Holdings. And they had no idea. As I walked past the familiar halls toward the executive summit, I could already hear the hum of voices behind the boardroom doors. My cousin Marcus was presenting the quarterly numbers, proudly crediting their anchor client for keeping operations thriving. That anchor client was us. Orion Holdings, formerly a small consulting firm I built from the ashes of that rejection. We now funneled over $60 million a year through their logistics division. We were their lifeline, and they never even looked close enough to see my fingerprints on it. I took a slow breath, adjusted the lapel of my navy blazer, and smiled to myself. They wanted legacy. They were about to find out what earned power really looked like. I still remember what I wore that day. A navy blue dress that didn't quite fit right, borrowed heels, and a folder clutched so tightly my knuckles turned white. I had spent weeks preparing, fine-tuning my proposal, cross-checking logistics systems, mapping out efficiencies I knew the company needed. I believed that day would mark the beginning of my real career. The meeting started like any other. I sat quietly at the edge of the conference table while my Aunt Margaret Brooks called the room to attention. She had always been the kind of woman who made silence feel like a test. Then came my turn. I stood up, heart pounding, and laid out my vision and expansion model for streamlining international operations using automation to cut costs by 18%. I had data, I had strategy, I had hope. And then the room went still. Margaret leaned back, folded her arms, and said the words I will never forget. "Olivia, you're smart. I'll give you that. But we don't make decisions here based on resumes. This company is built on legacy family. People who understand the culture," she paused, voice slicing through the room. "You don't quite fit." I remember the laughter. Not loud, not cruel, just dismissive. My cousin Marcus muttered something about how leadership wasn't just about numbers. Another executive chuckled. I forced a smile, swallowed the sting, and I walked out. No tears, not then. But in my car, alone in that parking lot, I cried like I hadn't cried since I was a kid. Not because they didn't pick me, but because I realized they never saw me as someone worth picking in the first place. That was the day I stopped asking for a seat at their table and started building my own. I didn't start with revenge in mind. I started with survival. After that rejection, job interviews felt like pity sessions. People looked at my last name and assumed I'd be handed opportunities. They didn't know I'd been shut out of the very legacy that name was tied to. So I stopped knocking on doors. I decided to build one instead. It began with a small idea, a consulting firm I called Orion Strategies. It's just me, one laptop, and a rented desk in a co-working space that smelled like burnt coffee and printer ink. I started cold calling small businesses, offering to help streamline their supply chains. I promised them results, and then I delivered. I worked 16-hour days, learned the parts of logistics no one talks about. I didn't just consult. I became the person my clients called when everything was falling apart. And they kept calling. One client became 3. 3 became 10. Soon, Orion wasn't just a side hustle. It was a lifeline for businesses too small to get attention from the big players. That's when I realized something. Small companies weren't the only ones struggling. Big ones were bloated with inefficiencies and blind spots. So I scaled up quietly, carefully. I restructured the business as Orion Holdings, reinvested every dollar I earned, hired smart, loyal people, some of whom had quietly walked away from Brooks Carrington after being overlooked or mistreated. I didn't need to expose the family's cracks. Why let them widen on their own while I built something stronger brick by brick? In just under 5 years. Orion Holdings was operating in 12 countries and managing over $180 million in logistics contracts annually. Our systems ran cleaner, faster, and more affordably than most legacy firms. And without ever advertising it, we became Brooks Carrington's biggest logistics client. They didn't know, of course. Orion was just another external name in their long list of partners. What they didn't realize was that every time they signed off on an Orion contract, they were depending on the very woman they once told didn't belong. I didn't want revenge. I wanted independence. But when your independence becomes their survival, well, sometimes those lines start to blur. The boardroom was exactly as I remembered it. Long mahogany table, leather chairs. Marcus stood at the head of the table, clicking through a flashy PowerPoint presentation. "We've had a strong quarter," he announced, "thanks in large part to our anchor client, Orion Holdings." My lips curled into a slight smile. I took a quiet sip of my coffee as murmurs of agreement swept through the board. No one questioned it. No one ever did. They thought they knew everything. And yet they had no idea who I was until Mila, Aunt Margaret's assistant, stepped into the room. "Ms. Brooks, they're ready for your presentation." Heads turned. Confused glances passed around the room. I stood up calmly and walked to the front, tablet in hand. The silence grew thick. "Wait, Olivia?" Marcus blinked like he was seeing a ghost. "What are you doing here?" I met his eyes without flinching. "I'm here on behalf of Orion Holdings," I said evenly. "We need to renegotiate several contract terms before renewal." Whispers rose, chairs shifted. Margaret narrowed her eyes. "That's not how this works," she said sharply. "Orion always sends a representative from their external group." I smiled, then projected my slide deck onto the screen. "They do, and you're looking at her?" The silence cracked like glass. "No," Marcus said softly. "No, that's not possible. You run some small firm." We did a background check. I tapped to the next slide. "Orion Holdings," I said. "Formerly Orion Strategies is mine. I've been running it for the past 6 years." Gasps, audible, real, slide by slide. I walked them through our audited financials. Annual revenue 3 times higher than theirs. Offices in 12 countries. A Fortune 500 client list. Their anchor client mice was also their biggest threat. I paused at the slide showing dependency metrics. 82% of your logistics revenue, 70% of your growth. Over half your client retention plans rely directly on Orion systems and contracts. Marcus turned pale. Elise dropped her pen. Margaret said nothing, but I could see her knuckles whitening around the armrests. Then I looked at Marcus. "You remember that internship mixer?" I asked. My voice low but steady. "When you told everyone I was just the niece who got too ambitious? Or when you said I'd never understand real business?" He said nothing. "Funny," I continued, "because while you were playing legacy games, I was quietly becoming the person keeping your numbers from bleeding red." The room burst into whispers. I stood still, composed. Let them absorb it. Let them remember every time they laughed, every time they shut a door in my face. I didn't need to scream. The truth was loud enough. No one spoke first. They were still trying to piece it all together. The numbers, the connections, the betrayal they didn't see coming. I gave them a moment longer, then clicked to the final slide. "This," I said, "is why I called this meeting." A single bar graph filled the screen, showed just how deeply Brooks Carrington depended on Orion Holdings. Nearly half of their entire revenue stream was tethered to our contracts. Without us, they weren't just unstable. They were insolvent. Marcus shot to his feet. "You can't just walk away," he said, his voice cracking. These contracts expire in 5 business days. I cut in. And as of today, I am no longer confident in your company's ability to meet the compliance and ethical standards we require. You can't do this, he snapped. I looked around the room. Oh, but I can, I said. And I will unless we agree to one of 2 options. I reached into my briefcase and slid a sealed envelope across the table. Option 1, I began. Actis resigns. Effective immediately. The board agrees to a full restructuring. Independent oversight is implemented. Orion Holdings continues a scaled-down partnership with direct supervision. Margaret's eyes widened. You're trying to humiliate us? No, I said calmly. I'm giving you a choice. What's option 2? Board member asked. A walk. Every contract with Orion is terminated and all internal financial records, including evidence of inventory manipulation, deferred revenue gains, and off-book liabilities, are submitted to the federal regulators. CCIRS, you name it. You're bluffing, Marcus said. I tilted my head. Would you like me to start with the dollar? $8.2 million. Hidden under miscellaneous operations or the phantom clients your reports claimed were active but have you logged a single order in 6 months. One of the outside directors swore under his breath. Another asked for the audit documents. I nodded to my team. They began distributing copies around the room. I built Orion on integrity. I said, something this company hasn't seen in years. You said this wasn't revenge, Marcus muttered. But it sure feels like it. I met his gaze, steady and unwavering. You're right, it's not revenge. I paused, letting the silence settle in again. It's business, the very thing you told me I'd never understand. The boardroom was a mess of whispers, papers, and frantic phone taps when I stood up and gathered my notes. I'll be in the office you once said I'd never deserve, I said softly. And then I left the room. As I stepped into the hallway, Mila, the same assistant who once ignored me, held the door open, her hands trembling. She didn't speak, just gave me a quiet nod. I nodded back. By the time I reached the elevator, my assistant, Michael, was already waiting. He handed me a bottle of sparkling water. All good, he asked. I smiled. Exactly as planned. The next morning, I arrived an hour early. Same building, same floors, but everything felt different now. The security guard, same one from 6 years ago, stood straighter when he saw me. Miss Brooks, he said with a hint of nervous pride. The board is already upstairs. Early, I murmured. Funny what the smell of collapse does to people. When I entered the executive suite, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel vindication. Felt clarity. Peace. Marcus was already seated, hunched over with legal counsel at his side. His eyes didn't meet mine. Margaret sat rigid at the head of the table, her authority now hollow. I placed 2 signed letters on the table. One was Marcus's resignation. The other, Margaret's early retirement package, proved and backed by the majority board vote just an hour ago. Neither of them fought it. They just signed as quietly as I had once left this room 6 years earlier. When it was over, Michael re-entered, this time holding a chilled bottle of champagne. Congratulations, he said, popping the cork with a grin. On your very elegant takeover. I turned toward the window, watching the harbor glint under the morning sun. It's not a takeover, I replied, eyes steady. It's accountability. They didn't lose because I wanted revenge. They lost because they underestimated the one person who was never allowed to compete. They said I didn't belong. Now they work for me. Later that evening, I sat alone in my new office, the one with the glass walls and the skyline view they said I'd never earn. I opened an old email buried in a dusty folder I had saved for this very moment. The subject line read, regarding your application. It was from Aunt Margaret. Dear Olivia, it began, while we admire your academic accomplishments, we believe leadership is about instincts, not credentials. Perhaps a role with fewer responsibilities would better suit your strengths. I printed it, folded it carefully, and placed it in the top drawer of the desk that now bore my name. The messages from family came quickly. My mother, you didn't have to humiliate your aunt. My father, shh, you're tearing us apart. My cousins, You've ruined everything. But I didn't feel like I'd ruined anything. I had simply stopped asking for permission to exist in a room I was more than qualified to lead. So I replied once, just once. Don't worry about the family name. Brooks Group is finally in qualified hands. And then I turned off my phone. Sometimes success isn't about being chosen, it's about choosing yourself. Sometimes the best kind of revenge isn't revenge at all. It's building something so undeniable that the very people who shut you out are forced to sit across the table and negotiate with you. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening, not just to my story, but to the quiet strength behind it. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told you weren't enough, you're not alone. You don't need permission to begin. You don't need approval to grow. And you definitely don't need their blessing to become who you were always meant to be. So, build your own table. And when they finally recognize you, let it be on your terms. Because the most powerful thing you can ever do is rise without needing revenge. And if you felt seen in this story, I hope you'll like, share, and leave a comment below. I'll be reading. Because sometimes the best success story starts with A.